How's it going, everyone? This is Rich, and we are in episode 22, and we're going to be talking about Melchizedek. In Hebrews chapter 7, he is mentioned as having no father, no mother, no genealogy, no beginning, no end. So most people would interpret this as some sort of an appearance of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, or what we refer to as a Christophany. Some people would say that he is a divine being, maybe the Archangel Michael in some extra biblical texts. And it's easy to interpret it this way because um, the descriptions suggest divinity. But I'm here to present an interpretation that doesn't necessarily have to suggest that Melchizedek was a divine being or a Christophany, but instead, Melchizedek was simply a type of Christ. And that is the point of the author of Hebrews. He wants to point out that Melchizedek, Jesus follows this kind of pattern, but not necessarily meaning to say that Jesus was an Old Testament appearance of Melchizedek was an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ. So we're going to look at a couple of passages about Melchizedek and see what we can find out. Now, the primary source for this is actually Genesis chapter 14, verse 17 to 20. And if you read it, it says here, after Abraham returned from defeating Kedor Laomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet Abraham in the valley of Shavah, known as the King's Valley. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was the priest of the Most High God. He blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth. Worthy of praise is the Most High God, who delivered your enemies into your hands. Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. There is also an allusion to Melchizedek in Psalm chapter 110, verse 4. It says here, The Lord makes this promise on oath and will not revoke it. So, meaning to say that God wouldn't change his mind. And to continue on, you are an eternal priest after the order of Melchizedek. So, if you read the context, this is actually talking about the Messiah. In Hebrews 5, you also see this allusion about Melchizedek. You are my son, today I have fathered you. And we've talked about this. This is actually enthronement language or appointment. And as also in another place, God says, you are the priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. You also see this in verse 10. It says here, he was designated by God as high priest in the order of Melchizedek. You also see that in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20. Now, Hebrews 7 is where we're going to park most of our time, because this is where it really gets interesting. Now, it says here, now, this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings and blessed him. So this is um, pretty much talking about the Genesis account that we just mentioned a while ago. To him also Abraham apportioned a tithe of everything. His name first means king of righteousness, then king of Salem, that is, king of peace. So two things I notice that the author is trying to tell his readers. First of all, Melchizedek, his name means righteousness, and it so happens that he rules over this place called Salem. So he is also the king of Salem. So you add both of them, you come up with a title, King of Righteousness, and at the same time, King of Peace. And this is attributed to Jesus Christ, titles that will be given to Jesus Christ later on. So he also mentioned that Abraham gave tithes to this character Melchizedek. So it means to say that Melchizedek is superior to Abraham. Okay, but the next verse is where it really gets interesting, because this is where the action, the where the reaction of people comes in about his divinity. So let's read it. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, he has neither beginning of days nor end of life, but is like the Son of God. So that's the key phrase there, like the Son of God. And he remains a priest for all time. Okay, so we're gonna you know, try to go through these phrases one by one. So in Genesis, all these details were never mentioned. There was no mention of his parentage. There was no mention of his genealogy, beginning of days, or where birthday, or when did he die. All these things were never mentioned. Okay, some would argue that To say to having no father and no mother would mean that he is illegitimate. But the key here, the key phrase here is without genealogy. Because without genealogy tells us that unlike the Levites, he was an exception to the rule or the Torah. Okay? Because in the Torah, only the Levites are allowed to become priests. Okay. Okay, let's continue on. Neither is there any mention of his birth or his death, which would somehow describe him as divine. People would understood that as divine. That is why it is really tempting to include that this is talking about Jesus Christ's appearance in the Old Testament. But again, there is a way to make sense of this without concluding that he is divine or Jesus Christ. And the giveaway here is the phrase like the Son of Man or resembling the Son of God, meaning he shows similarity with the Son of God, but not the Son of God. ESV actually says Melchizedek was not, in fact, the Son of God, but someone resembling the Son of God, literally having been made like the Son of God. Okay, so I think that's very clear. Now, and then it says ESV as well mentions that the OT or the Old Testament mentions no end to his priesthood. In that sense, he continues a priest forever. Hebrews seems to view Melchizedek as an ordinary man. He was a type or foreshadowing of Christ, who is truly the King of righteousness, who's going to bring true peace later on. Okay, so these details in Genesis, I think, this is me speaking right now. I think it might be deliberate. Okay. I think the author deliberately left out these information in Genesis, at least for two reasons. First of all, those details were not necessary. The point of the story in Genesis is that Abraham offers tithes to Melchizedek. Okay. You don't need to talk about his origins or destiny of Melchizedek. It doesn't mean that you don't, that you, as of course, it doesn't mean as well that you cannot. But the author of Genesis chose not to include it or provide more details about Melchizedek, which brings me to my second point. It is possible that the author of Genesis intentionally left these information out because he wants to paint Melchizedek to look like a divine character in order to resemble a picture of the coming Christ. He doesn't say that he is divine, but the omissions or leaving out these information makes him, or at least would communicate to the reader later on, that you know what, this guy, since he doesn't, since it doesn't mention about his birth, his beginnings, or he doesn't have a parentage or genealogy, he seems to pattern, he seems to make quite a good example of what the Messiah would look like. Okay, so again, as if you look at ESV commentary in ESV, as mentioned a while ago, Melchizedek was not in fact the Son of God, but someone resembling the Son of God, literally having been made like the Son of God. So, based on the account of him in Genesis, there is no reason to think that he was immortal, or that he did not die, or that he did not have parents that gave birth to him. Okay, NKJV, Cultural Background Study Bible Notes, actually says when useful, Jewish interpreters would argue from silence that was not stated, did not occur. The author of Hebrews can use this tactic for the sake of elaborating the Psalms comparison, because the psalmist invites a comparison with the Melchizedek explained in Genesis. Hebrews probes details, since no parents are mentioned, and since Genesis usually lists parents, the priest like Melchizedek lacks this beginning, since he is a priest forever in Psalm 110 verse 4. He is also lacking ending. So Greeks would view this as someone who is divine, having no beginning, having no ending. So while others exalted, Melchizedek perhaps he was an angelic figure of something. But the point is this: Melchizedek's origin and death were not mentioned, okay, so that to argue this point, since he has no beginning, again, going back to what the commentary says, is that, they could argue from silence, okay? Since there is no record of his birth, you could sort of argue that he had no beginning. I mean, it's like, that's how they argue. I don't know why they do that. You can also sort of argue that since he has no death, that means he didn't die, meaning he is immortal. So this is some sort of a literary way of presenting this kind of argument. Now, this this might be what the author of Genesis was doing. And of course, the whole idea was to direct the reader's attention to the Messiah later on, an eternal priest whose origin is from eternity past and extends way beyond eternity future. Namely, of course, we know this in the person of Jesus Christ. That is, I mean, this is one way for them to present an argument. Now, if you check 110, Psalm 110, the context here, as I've mentioned, it's talking about the Messiah, but then the psalmist picks up on the literary style of Genesis and describes the nature of the Messiah's priesthood as something that follows this pattern described in the accounts of Melchizedek in Genesis. He sort of picks up what the author of Genesis was trying to do in the account of Melchizedek. So he used this pattern in order to describe the kind of priesthood that the Messiah would have. He sort of connects the pattern of the storytelling about Melchizedek and connects it to the person and priesthood of Jesus Christ. So I mean, just look at what he says here. You are an eternal priest after the pattern of Melchizedek. So this is not saying that Melchizedek is God. Okay. So God is not, if you read the entire verse, the Lord makes this promise on oath and will not revoke it. You are eternal priest after the pattern of Melchizedek, meaning God is not going to change his mind about this priesthood of the Messiah, because he took an oath. Okay, he made a promise that this is going to be an eternal priesthood. Okay, like the pattern, pattern from the story of Melchizedek in Genesis. Okay, unlike the Levitical priesthood, where their origins and deaths were mentioned in the Old Testament, you don't see that with Melchizedek. So this was intentional because it was trying to paint a picture. It was trying to paint Melchizedek as divine, not as divine, but rather you have to look at the literary style of the details were not included, the death, because if there is death, then definitely he's going to look like he's human being, right? But it doesn't do that, right? It doesn't portray him as normal. It doesn't portray, it removes it intentionally removes all these details so that the readers could somehow, okay, I'm going to argue from silence that this guy is, very similar to the Messiah, something like that. Okay, so I hope I'm making sense, right? Now the author of Hebrews sees this connection. He sees this connection in the Psalm and in Genesis. So he elaborates on this to point the fact the priesthood of Christ is similar to Melchizedek. He's sort of telling his readers, hey, look at the pattern or guidelines of the priesthood of Melchizedek. Okay, it is completely outside the requirements of Torah. So it is with, so it's the same with the priesthood of Christ. So he's trying to point out something, that the priesthood of Christ, which is patterned with Melchizedek, is outside the guidelines mentioned in Leviticus, or in Torah. I mean, check this one out. Just like Melchizedek, Christ's priesthood does not depend on genealogy. Unlike, I mean, Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. Unlike the Levitical priests, they would have to be from the tribe of Levi. Just like Melchizedek, Christ is not under but superior to Abraham. Unlike the Levitical priesthood, who were the descendants of Abraham, so they were inferior to Abraham. Now, just like Melchizedek, Christ's priesthood has no ending since he is now alive. Okay, I mean, it portrays, it removes that part of Melchizedek's death in order to put to communicate that Christ is going to be an eternal priest, unlike the Levitical priest who has ending. Okay, meaning their priests had no permanence. They stop being a priest once they die, and they had to be replaced. Okay, just like Melchizedek, Christ's priesthood was not according to what was prescribed in the Torah, which states that the priest had to come from Levi, from the tribe of Levi. But Jesus's priesthood was based on the promise and approval of God. So that is far more superior. I mean, in the Levitical priesthood, as long as you're in the right tribe, you could become a priest, but not with Jesus. He had to accomplish something. He had to be appointed, and he has to have the approval of God in order for him to be appointed the high priest. Okay, in short, Jesus's priesthood was far superior to the Levitical priesthood. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make here is that the author of Hebrews is not talking about the true nature of Melchizedek. He's not saying that Melchizedek is divine. Rather, he is illustrating the fact that the guidelines on which Melchizedek was selected as a priest of the Most High God is going to be used, or is the same guidelines that is applied to the choosing of Jesus Christ as our high priest. Okay, it's not about, again, it's not about the right genealogy or pedigree, but appointed and approved by God. Okay, so rather than simply following a set of rules mentioned in the Torah, since this is approved by God, God is not changing his mind. Christ's priesthood has no end, unlike some priests in the Old Testament, which ends once they die, once God removes them from office. Jesus's priesthood is far more superior than the Levitical priesthood. And I think that's the key message of what the author of Hebrews is trying to tell us, and not really about the divinity of Melchizedek. Again, you have to remember the key person or character that we're talking about is Jesus Christ and not Melchizedek. Okay, so let me know what you think. Comments below. And until next time, God bless.